Hey guys, what is up and welcome to a new Tesla update video. So today, as per usual, let's go over Tesla stock. Let's go over the market. Let's talk about what happened today in the markets. Another pretty brutal day in the markets, but a pretty decent recovery off of the lows. I'll go over the broader market as well. I'm actually going to keep it on QQQ just so I don't forget. Sometimes I say that and I forget. But yeah, let's talk about it. I'll give you my thoughts going forward and all that good stuff. If you enjoyed, don't forget to hit that like button. This is not financial advice and I am not a financial advisor. And of course, if you enjoy my technical analysis, thoughts on the charts, updates, etc., well, again, I do have a YouTube membership. That link, of course, is down below in the description of every single video. We'd love to have you there. Where, I constantly share my thoughts, posts, updates, options flow, technical analysis, constantly on charts throughout the trading day as the market is trading. So definitely check it out. But I should say the pricing for that, $3 a month includes all my Tesla updates. And sometimes I obviously talk about broader market updates like SPY, QQQ, or like things like, Berkshire Hathaway I talked about recently, etc. $5 a month adds NVDA to that as well, plus everything in the first tier. And then the third tier includes the first two tiers plus for $7 a month, plus non-Tesla, non-NVIDIA stocks that I share charts with members. And over the weekend, we do chart requests on Discord. But jumping into it, before we go into Tesla, again, I said I wanted to do a very quick market overview on Qs and SPY. Well, Qs are looking pretty interesting. The Qs did actually off of this low down over here before we ended up rallying off of, off of this pivot low over here to the fresh all-time highs, right? We ended up getting fresh all-time highs off of this pivot low down here. So you take the Fibonacci from down here to up here. And then what do we get? Well, we got a retracement on the Qs right down into the green fibs and even closed up not only above the green fibs, but even above the 618 Fibonacci, which is a good sign. And this could actually still be looked at as a potential bullish retracement as long as this low holds. Now, if we start losing this low, essentially 550 on the Qs, that could spell trouble. We could get a deeper correction back down to pretty much retesting previous all-time highs closer to about the 530s. So let's continue monitoring that one step at a time. But as of right now, this could still be actually technically viewed as a bit of a bullish retracement. And, I wouldn't be surprised if we get a bullish move to the upside off of this kind of, low, if you will, today that was set. But I would be looking at short term, at least, I would definitely be looking at about 575 as that shorter term sort of resistance level on the Qs, because we could also get this into a move that looks something like that. So the bulls essentially want to not only hold pretty much today's low roughly, ideally, but they definitely want to start recapturing 575 and ultimately, well, breaking fresh all-time highs. That's going to be the plan. But nice retracement so far and pretty decent volume, but right at the fibs so far. This could have some bullish implications, but we have Jackson Hole on Wednesday or Friday, so let's see how that plays out. Now, going into Tesla specifically, right? Tesla down about 1.63%, closing just shy of $324, but mine is clearly just in another world right now. Also in a pretty interesting position, similar to what I just showed you on the Qs, right? Tesla, there's lots to go over, but to start things off, Tesla could be, again, if we remove all trend lines, we try to just remove all that noise and we just look at strictly retracements, strictly Fibonacci levels, right? Off of this low that we had over here, because we still technically broke this high over here and we did set this fresh high above this 338 high, which, obviously this one was about 350 almost. This could still also, similar to the Qs I just showed you, be viewed as a bullish retracement right into those 618 Fibonacci. And so far we're holding right around there, which in this case, of course, was around that 317.5-ish level, which is what I shared with members earlier today, which is also roughly where that 50 exponential moving average sits. So the bulls actually still have this sort of bullish perspective that this could still be a bullish retracement into continuation higher. That is still actually in the cards. Now, granted, there still has been damage to the chart in terms of, the overall, from the trend line perspective, if you will, which we'll go over very soon in the more bearish perspective. But from the bullish perspective, there is still this potential. Personally, I would like to see a reclaim of about the 330, essentially the low, very low 330s, 330, maybe 333. I personally, for just stronger confidence, I would like to see that reclaimed. If we can see that reclaimed, if Tesla can get back above those very low 330s, the bullish potential is actually still very valid. Honestly, it's actually still, a valid, realistic potential here. And the bulls can still actually get control. Now, there's, like I said, there is damage done to the chart, which we'll go over very, very soon. But again, if we were to put on our bullish hat and look at it through a more bullish lens, that is still that possibility. Now, obviously, what the bulls do not want to see is, well, they do not want to see essentially not only this lower trend line of this pennant lost, but they definitely don't want to see essentially the very low 300s lost where that green fib sits. If we start losing this and especially start losing this low at pretty much 300 itself, that is where, the bears can really start taking control and they get their shot at taking this and making this into a bearish reversal to the downside. So the bulls don't want to see that. But as long as pretty much this region right around here holds, there is still bullish potential that, in my opinion, needs stronger validation, for instance, such as breaking back above pretty much the very, very low 330s, just for stronger confidence. But it's not something I can fully ignore off of that perspective. But like I said, there has been damage done to the chart, which is why, to me, that validation of a reclaim again of about 330 to 333 roughly, in my opinion, would be nice to see. That would definitely inspire more confidence in the chart because, well, let's go to the bearish things. Let's go to the more concerning aspects of the chart. There has been damage done to the chart. Absolutely. So I guess we'll start on the daily. We'll continue on the daily, right? Well, the simple one is, of course, well, we have essentially broken back into this pennant, right? This can now be potentially viewed as a false breakdown, right? Or breakout, I should say. Obviously, it's just one candle. Let's see what the next couple of days brings, of course, especially with Jackson Hole on Friday. There's still some volatility potentially in the cards here. So I don't want to jump to full conclusions just because we broke one candle back down into this pennant. But obviously, it's still not a great look, right? Obviously, it would have been better if this didn't happen and we continued holding essentially above this general range. Now, we're going to go to the 1 hour time frame very soon. But that is kind of that damage, if you will, to the chart, which is why now to me, for me to I still have this potential bullish scenario that I just explained, but for me to really start actually, I guess you can say, acting upon it, if that makes sense, I absolutely would want to see 330-ish reclaim, right? That, that absolutely would make me more confident about it, right? Which we'll go more over on, the 1 hour time frame when we jump into it. But that's kind of the red flag, if you will. The red flag, yeah, we lost this 327 low I kept mentioning about. We closed below it. We're back below the 21 EMA. The EMAs are still bullish, but the MACD's kind of curling back down. We ideally wouldn't want to see this go back to red. So there is damage to the chart. We are losing steam here a little bit. Now, can the bulls reclaim that, and can the bulls set up another potential bullish pattern? Absolutely. But they had a great opportunity here, which was technically somewhat fumbled. It is what it is. Sometimes that's just how the cookie crumbles. That's just how it goes. The setup I would have taken any day of the week. Obviously, I did get stopped out on it. And now I'm observing, right? I am observing, full transparency, and I'm looking for potential another bullish opportunity, which, like I said, back above can give that sort of signal, if you will, which can also potentially signal a very large potential bullish head and shoulders pattern. Again, we'll go over more of that on the 1 hour time frame. But that's kind of what the daily is suggesting, right? The daily, I wouldn't say has fully collapsed. I wouldn't say the daily is bearish necessarily, unless you're looking at this false breakout as being completely bearish, which, it's a valid perspective. And then we get a very strong move to the downside. But in order for bears, in my opinion, to really gain control, if the bears really want to send this stock lower, if the bears really want to bring this down, well below these levels, like back into the 200s, we need to not only, from the bearish perspective, lose this pennant to the downside, pretty much what the bulls failed to do here, but the bears need to succeed at doing that, but also definitely want to go ahead and start losing that 300-ish level as well. So those are the main things I'll be looking at right now. The stock, to me, has entered slightly neutral, maybe still slightly bullish, mainly because of the Fibonacci's, but definitely of a more neutral perspective, where again, I'm just kind of stepping aside for now, and I'm just letting the chart kind of show its, hand to me. I'm letting the stock tell me what it really wants to do next before I jump into another trade. My opinion, of course, that's just how I'm looking at it right now. Going to the 4 hour chart very, very quickly, we do have the SMI curling near the bottom end of the spectrum. So remember, I kept talking about how we should get a cool off. Unfortunately, the cool off is a little bit more of a cool off than I initially anticipated, obviously. But nonetheless, that cool off has cooled off essentially, right? We have reached the bottom end of the SMI over here. You can see anytime it's been pretty much around this green area and very close to the bottom, it has. We'll see how this one goes, but it has marked bottoms, actually. Believe it or not, it has marked bottoms. It has been pretty powerful overall. And same with the tops. Anytime we've been close to the top, it has marked, tops as well, right? Anytime we've been close to the top over here, it's also marked at least a short-term top. Now, the thing with this SMI, you have to understand the difference between this versus like the exponential moving averages or the MACD is that it doesn't show momentum. This just shows the fact that when we're up here, we're probably not going to go much higher right away. At the very least, we'll stall out a bit before maybe continuing higher later, but at the very least, we stall out. Same with the bottom side. It doesn't necessarily mean that we reverse and we start trending way higher. It just means that we probably will stop bleeding out from here on out. And there's a good chance that at the very least we go sideways, or the bleeding is much, much slower to the downside, or a small reversal. This is why I personally like to combine this with selling options, because you can be right a lot more than wrong based on this indicator, but it doesn't necessarily signify reversal, if that makes sense, right? Again, just because it's reversed, it doesn't mean that the whole stock reversed. It was just like a short-term bounce, then a short-term top, and then a short-term bounce, short-term top. It's not like we're reversing, we're going meaningfully higher. It's important to make that distinction. That's where trend indicators are for, right? This is more of short-term reversal indicators, while, like an EMA, for instance, is more of a trend indicator. This is not trend, worth mentioning. But nonetheless, the point is the fact that this does suggest the fact that, there's a good chance that this sort of, 320 to 315 low that we set today should hold at least for several days, right? That's kind of what it suggests. So let's continue monitoring that as well. I do want to very quickly mention the weekly chart before we finish off with the 1 hour candle here. And the weekly chart is something that I'm definitely eyeballing pretty aggressively here. If we can close this week back above 330, which is also, like I said, on the daily, reclaiming 330, like the low 330, 330, 333. If we can reclaim that and hold above that, especially by the end of the week, that would be a pretty good sign actually for the bulls, because then that saves this weekly candle. We don't close back within this range, because remember, a lot of these weekly candles, what do? They all kind of went up in this general vicinity in the high 330s, maybe low 340s ish region, if you will, but they all kind of ended up collapsing back under. So I wouldn't want to see that happen with this weekly candle as well, where we essentially collapse and close back into this overall massive noise, essentially sub 330. That would definitely complicate things a little bit and make the stock substantially more of a neutral perspective. However, if the weekly and the daily by Friday can start getting closures back above, again, those low 330s, then we can start continuing to look at this as, well, maybe we are actually turning this region right here into a support, which of course was a resistance all back here. And now we're starting to try to turn it back into a support. But again, this needs to close above 330 on the weekly. So let's see how pretty much the last 2 days of the week go. Could be pretty important. But from a bearish perspective, there are two arguably, false breakouts here, right? That is a concern, right? If we close below 330 by the end of this week, this does bring potentially a little bit more emphasis, if you will, to the fact that we had two false breakouts last week and potentially this week as well, especially below 330 on the weekly closure, which does make this a little more questionable for sure, as the weekly will continue suggesting the fact that we're still very much stuck in this pennant. So if you're looking at it from a weekly perspective, you want to see a weekly candle close above or below the pennant, and from there, that's where we can actually get a bit of a stronger confirmation as well of things to come. So the weekly still hasn't really suggested the fact that we have actually broken out or down just yet. So let's continue monitoring the weekly as well. And the final thing I'll go over is the 1 hour time frame. Now, I mentioned the 1 hour, right? We had this potential falling wedge, which, again, I would have taken this setup any day of the week. This was a pretty textbook setup. Could have been a nice retest, higher high here, higher low into a higher continuation. It absolutely could have played out that way. Obviously, things don't always go the way you would expect them, right? Or else trading would be too easy. So that's where we have stops. And I mentioned many times how the stop to me right now is essentially losing this 327 low right here is a red flag, right? If we lose this low right around here, that to me is a red flag. And that's exactly what happened. And you can see the second we lost that, we flushed down very aggressively, and we could be setting up a bit of a bear flag here, which is something I'm monitoring as well, which I'll briefly go over on the 15-minute time frame. There's just so much information. But that's kind of what I'm looking at right now. And that's kind of, sometimes why you have to respect stops, right? Especially in delicate situations like this, yeah, we lost 327. I got stopped out. I did take a small loss on it, obviously full transparency. I'm not going to pretend like I didn't. Of course I did. But, I avoided a pretty decent flush, right? And I ended up selling cash I could put here, made a little bit of that money back. And now we're, back to, neutral, if you will, for me, at least personally, as I'm monitoring this potential bear flag moving forward. So let's continue monitoring and see how that goes. But all I'm going to say is the fact that this setup absolutely had potential. Unfortunately, it just didn't really go out very well. And the final thing is, again, like that bear flag, which I mentioned, is something I'm watching. We pretty much retraced right up to that 618 Fibonacci level roughly. And that's kind of what I'm monitoring right now, right? This bear flag still has potential to play out, right? Where we had this massive move to the downside, potential bear flag slash dead cat, if you will, to the Fibonacci's could go a little bit higher. We could test that 327 breakdown, which is where the green fibs are sitting. That is still a possibility. So we could still, go a little bit higher for sure. But, one of these two levels, there is potential for a rejection and, most likely a retest closer to the lows down here as well, back to this sort of 315 to 320 lows once again. And from there, if the bulls can really come in, we could potentially get a double bottom setup, and then we can maybe go higher from there. But, one step at a time, of course. But all in all, that's what I got for you. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching. In terms of options flow, surprisingly, not as bearish as you would think. Pretty mixed throughout the day, but some bulls definitely started stepping in here. You can see some shorter term calls came in for pretty much the next 2 days as the bulls were buying this when the stock was at 322. So not too much higher than where it is right now, honestly. But, overall, surprisingly, options flow wasn't as bearish as you would have expected. So let's continue monitoring that as well moving forward. But thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow. Peace.